Voices of the people, loud and pure. Alberta unfiltered, strong and sure.
Good afternoon, Nadine. It's great to have you here on Alberta Unfiltered. I've known you for a while, very impressed with your activism in the province of Alberta, our great Northwest land of prosperity. New term for Albertans. I'm very impressed with your knowledge about equalization in the Canada Pension Plan particularly. So we're going to spend some time on that today. Can you explain to us in simple terms how you became interested in the Canada Pension Plan topics?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. It's a wonderful studio that you have here. And of course, we have been friends now, I would say friends for at least a few years.
Yes.
You know a little bit of my story as it relates to politics. I started in 2018. I was very much intrigued by the policies that were introduced by the People's Party of Canada, of course, and Maxime Bernier.
Yes.
And then my experience and background with campaigning federally led me into the provincial domain. So then with the election of Danielle Smith, and when she decided that she was going to promote an Alberta pension plan, of course, my background as a chartered investment manager for the last 2 decades working in finance, I just went, this is amazing. Finally, we're going to actually move Alberta into an area where it's more independent. We can actually exercise some leverage with Ottawa by taking back control of our own financial destinies here. And, you know, for a lot of people, they say, well, you know, I'm a Canadian first. Well, I'm an Albertan first. And all of my campaigns have been run that way.
Let's just talk about your background a little bit. You have a background in economics. You've also gone to university and have a degree in...
So my degree is actually in recreation administration. I started out a long time ago in healthcare, believe it or not. And I went back to university, got my degree in recreation administration. I worked for the Department of National Defense. I worked for CFB Goose Bay. I managed all of their facilities. So they had a gymnasium, a theater, a curling club, even a ceramics club. So, you know, I managed all of those facilities. I managed their winter carnival. I was the chairman of their winter carnival at one point, which used to be one of the largest winter carnivals in all of North America.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
It
And
was.
we have the privilege of having you here in Alberta, our great Northwest of prosperity.
Yes.
And you've really made a mark here. You bring a lot of intelligence. And so what I'd like you to explain today for our audience is if you were learning for the first time about the benefits of Alberta having its own Alberta pension plan, rather than contributing to the Canadian pension plan, how would you describe it quite simply?
I guess the first question I always tell people is you have to understand what the Canada Pension Plan is and what the Canada Pension Plan is not. So it is not a pension plan. It is a payroll tax.
A which tax?
A payroll tax.
A payroll tax.
Yes.
Okay.
So there's this little thing. If I was an investor and I said, hey, Marilyn, if I could have $100 and I took that $100 from you and then I walked that $100 over and gave it to another investor, what's that called? It's called a Ponzi scheme. That's exactly how originally the Canada Pension Plan was established. It was, I'm going to take $100 from you, and then I'm going to take that $100 because you're still working, and I'm going to distribute that to retirees.
Is there not some interest involved, though, so that $100 would grow over time?
No, originally, up until 1997, we had about 7. So you have to go back to when the CPP was originally formed. So back in the 1960s, it came into force in the 1966. We had 7 to 8 Canadians working for every one person who was retired.
Sure.
Okay, that's shifted over time. Now we only have 3 Canadians working for every one person retired.
We better keep those old people working.
We have to. If you want your Canada Pension Plan to stay alive, then you best. So what happened, though, is because we had 7 to 8 people working, they set up a structure that said, hey, we'll take from the little bit that we need from the workers today to fund the retirees. But what's happened now is, if you notice your Canada pension premiums, I call it a tax because that's exactly what it is, they've continued to go up, yes?
For the younger folks, is there a difference in age? Everybody's taxed the same?
Everybody pays the same as far as the tax goes. It starts from like you get your first $3,000 exemption.
And you know, when I say tax, I mean the Canada Pension Plan deduction.
But it is what it is. It's a tax. It's a payroll tax. And if you had a pension you would take your money, you would put it into a separate bank account, and your employer would match that, right? Because that's usually how it sets up now, or you would contribute it on your own. And then what would happen is those assets, you would manage them, you can control them, you could borrow against them if you needed them, you could access them. Even if you had to keep it till you were retired, you could hand them down to your kids or your spouse afterwards. Sure. For a lot of people, the Canada Pension Plan is none of that. You have no control, you have no say, you're going to receive a benefit when it comes time for you to retire. You can't claim that benefit anywhere until you're at least 60 to 65. You can wait till you're later. If you die, let's say before the age of 60 and you haven't claimed for your Canada Pension Plan, and let's say you're single, who gets the money?
You tell me, is it nobody?
The government keeps it.
That's really nice.
Every contribution you've ever made, the government will keep. So again, that's not how a pension would be structured.
Yes.
So it is a payroll tax. And unfortunately for a lot of people, they think that it is their money. It is an asset that sits on the government's balance sheet. It is not your money.
It's really pathetic, actually.
And the CPPIB was set up, which is the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. It was set up in 1997 because what happened is they recognized that they were running out of money. It wasn't sustainable.
Who was running out of money for what?
The government, because we didn't have enough workers in comparison to the number of retirees, which is growing because we have this little cohort called the baby boomers, which are aging and retiring. And you don't have the same number of people coming up under the next generation, right? So the Gen X, and now you've got the Gen Zs and the Gen Ys. There's just not enough of us to fund the commitments that the government had made through the pension plan. So people now, are talking about, well, you should be 67 before you get your OAS. Why? Because there's another government benefit program that has commitments that is underfunded. And now we don't have the working class. It's not big enough to fund the growth in the retiree segment.
OAS means?
Old age security.
Who funds that?
Now that's the government. But of course, that's your tax dollars. So we, the taxpayer, or as Quinn likes to say, the tax giver, is funding that program.
So the tax givers pay into the general revenue of the government, and then the government pays old age security at what age?
Old age security now at 67.
And until then, a retired person is only entitled to Canada Pension Plan at the age of 60, 61?
60, you can apply and start collecting your Canada Pension Plan.
The longer you wait, the more you get.
The longer you wait, yes, there are benefits to your benefit as far as increasing in value to what you get. But you have to offset that by taking a look at your own personal history, how long you expect to live, longevity, and then offsetting it with whether you're working, not working. So that's a big question from a retirement planning perspective. A lot of clients come to me and they say, well, Nadine, I'm going to retire at 60, but I'm going to live off my RSP money, for example. And I'm like, well, why would you live off of your money when maybe the government should be giving you part of what you've paid into it back first? And because your money you have control over, you can use it all in one lump sum, you can leave it to your kids, whereas your Canada Pension Plan, you can't do that. It is very fixed rules and regulations around how it can be used, not be used, when it starts and when it stops.
That's very interesting. So when it comes to where we are right now with 3 people contributing to an older person's pension, what's the consequence of what's going on right now?
So this is where 1997, they recognized that it was not sustainable. So they made changes to it. So they increased the premiums, right? The tax. They said, you have to pay more, Marilyn, right? Because we know that we can't continue to sustain this. It's not a sustainable system. And they developed the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, CPPIB, which has since changed their name again. But most people know it as CPPIB, Canada Pension Plan Investment Board.
Who manages that?
That's an independent board, but it answers to the Minister of Finance.
Oh, does it? Okay.
So how much independence it actually has, if you look at their regulations and you look at their policies, it is riddled, and I mean riddled, with DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. It is riddled with ESG, environment, social, and governance, riddled with their climate change policy. That is not independence. That is being dictated down from government, and it is filtered into what they invest in. And it's so funny, if you take a look at their website just even a few years ago, they don't invest necessarily in Canadian oil and gas, but they're happy to invest in China and coal. They're happy to invest in oil and gas in other countries.
Saudi Arabia, for example, perhaps?
Right. Well, Saudi Arabia pretty much invests in itself, so they're pretty good. But again, global opportunities that, you would think that, well, if you're not going to invest in them in our own country, you wouldn't be investing them in other countries. But that's not the case at all, actually. It's rather hypocritical in that front. And then they had a net zero was their big headline just a couple of years ago on the front page of their website. And I laugh because here we are in Alberta in particular, oil and gas province. And that is our bread and butter. That's what funds and feeds the Canada Pension Plan. We have, I won't say over-contributed because it's not the appropriate word, but we have paid into the Canada Pension Plan to the tune of about $60 billion more than what Alberta residents have ever received.
Do you mean Alberta people have paid more?
Yes, the province of Alberta has paid in about $60 billion, and CBC will actually support those numbers. They actually did a report a few years back that actually spoke to exactly this. And so if CBC says it's true, it must be true, right? So $60 billion is what Albertans as a province have contributed over the years, more than what they've actually received back in benefits.
How does that compare to other provinces?
We are basically we are funding the other provinces. So when people talk about, like I said, 1997, they invented this CPPIB, this board to now take surpluses to manage. The majority of those surpluses are coming from the province of Alberta.
So what you're saying is all of our young and middle-aged workers in Alberta, who sometimes work in very difficult conditions, are funding the CPP for older people in the rest of Canada.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And to make matters worse, they now know, because come 2026, the revenues from the working population can no longer fund the retiring baby boomers that we have. So they will start dipping into the assets now of that investment board to filter the difference. So to make up the difference. So now what happens is that 600 and some odd billion that the CPP likes to say, these are the assets we have. They will now have to start drawing down on those because we have, again, more retirees than we have workers. But interestingly enough, when you talk about who's funding it, there is what's called the additional CPP now. So it only applies to higher earning individuals. Albertans have the youngest working demographic, which is why we get the least, because we have not a lot of retirees. Our population is young, they're working. So thus we contribute a lot and don't receive a lot back in benefits. But more importantly, we have the highest incomes in the country. And CPP intentionally put an additional payroll tax on, not only what everybody pays and contributes to. Now this additional is for a higher tax bracket, which will adversely impact Albertans even again.
Do you know what that bracket is?
I think so. Right now we have up to 83,200, and the additional then is from, I think, 78,000 or 76. It might be 78,000. I think up to about 83,200.
Most people don't see their stubs on their paychecks because there's automatic deposit now. So this is really interesting information that we are paying an additional amount off our paychecks.
Well, we have the highest incomes in the rest of Canada. So when government makes policies, you can't tell me that they didn't know this. So Alberta, being the highest income earners, I think our average, salary is significantly more than the rest of, like, say, Ontario or Quebec or other parts of the province, other parts of the country. And so for me, I always look at fairness. And I mean, we're already over contributing because we have a younger workforce, but now to be that much more punitive in adding an additional 4% that comes off because you earn from this bracket to this bracket, knowing that Albertans fall into that category far more than any other province in Canada.
Do you know when that started?
They would have started implementing that back a few years ago. And then the last stage of that is implemented, I think, this year and in 2026. So it's been a gradual increase. But yeah, they started the additional CPP, I think it was 2019. Don't quote me on those. It's been a little while since I've had this conversation, so the specifics are a little bit vague. But yeah, it hasn't been too long, but it's been long enough that it's been around. And they knew that it's actually in the CPP has to do a report every year. And in that report, it actually speaks to the risks of the Canada pension itself. And the big one is demographics, of which Alberta doesn't have that problem. We are the youngest demographic with the highest income. You got provinces like Newfoundland where that's the exact opposite, very low incomes and a very old, retired population. Yes. So our demographics are very different. And then, of course, immigration is a big concern and issue. So thus, people ask me all the time, well, why do we have all these immigration policies? Why are we bringing so many people into the country? Is because they're trying to find the revenues. But you have to, when you're looking at, increasing the population, more is not always better. We would have been better off to increase productivity than to bring in more people, because now what we've done is we brought in more people, but there's a higher cost to that.
I want to talk about that in a minute, because I just had some recent experience about that. I want to go back to the added CPP tax. Whose responsibility was that to communicate that to our people? Was it the provincial government? Was the federal government responsible to say, guess what, young Albertans, you're getting more off your paycheck now?
Yeah, well, they say that it's applied to everybody equally across the country.
But that's not my question.
And who's responsible for letting
people know?
There's ways that, you can pay more tax or you can pay less tax. It's not the government's job to educate you. That's what they'll tell you. It's not CRA's job to educate you. It's not, so you are somewhat responsible for knowing these things in and of yourself. But here's an interesting thing. The province has the ability to run, own, control their own pension.
Yes, that's correct.
Right? It's a choice to remain with the Canada Pension Plan. With the stroke of a pen, Danielle Smith, our premier, could have said, we're pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan and establishing our own. That would have given us 3 years to put into place all the right mechanisms, the infrastructure, the people to actually take over the pension plan, what is owed to us from the federal government and the federal plan, the CPP,
transition period.
Right? A transition period. And then we'd be up and running and administering it own. That would have saved us $3 to $5 billion a year alone. If we got absolutely $0 from the federal government, from the CPP-IB, we actually are still better off establishing our own Alberta pension plan.
And you mean us? When you say us and we, you mean the people who work in Alberta?
Albertans. We would be better off having our own Alberta pension plan, even if we got not a single dollar from the Canada Pension Plan.
How is what you would envision, how does that compare to what the people in Quebec have?
So Quebec never joined the Canada Pension Plan. They were very smart about that. Their money is managed independent. They do have a pension plan, but it's managed is kept internal. And in addition to that, it has a slightly different mandate because it actually is designed to not only ensure that there's a pension there for their citizens, or I shouldn't say a pension, a benefit is what it is. So even somebody like myself, you find yourself slipping into that language quite easily. But the reality is it has an economic driver as well. So they do invest in Quebec projects, and it is managed by Caisse de Dépôt. So it's not managed by the CPP-IB. They never opted into that system. And one of the big debates that so many people have had is that, you can't leave. I remember when this first came out and Danielle made the announcement that, here we have the Alberta Pension Plan. We're going to put this out to a referendum. Why you would ever put this out to a referendum, I don't know. It's another obstacle that she put into her own path that never had to be there. Bill 2, in my opinion, just needs to be repealed. Get rid of it. It doesn't belong. We don't need a referendum on this. Her job is to act in the best interest of Albertans. This is definitely in the best interest of Albertans. This was an education process, and she has failed miserably, in my opinion, on that. And because we had a referendum on equalization, and I know we want to talk about that too.
Of sorts.
But people understood that if they wanted equalization to go away. Right? I think 63%. They understood that equalization, make it go away. We don't support it any longer. Well, interestingly enough, the Canada Pension Plan, Alberta is in essence paying a $3 to $5 billion a year equalization payment to the Canada Pension Plan.
That's a really interesting segue that you're equating the Canada Pension Plan to be part of an equalization process apart from the equalization payments.
Yeah, except we had an easy way out. It was a stroke of a pen.
Yes.
And our premier didn't take that option. And instead, she put an obstacle in her path, making it difficult not only for this government, but for the next government or any government down the road now, because it's a law that says we have to have a referendum on this. And the CPPIB, and the CPP, the Canada Pension Plan Act, there is no restriction. It was just literally give your notice and have that 3-year transition plan with a like or similar plan already put into place.
How does it make any sense that Danielle Smith would raise the issue and then put an obstacle in her own path?
Well, you have to understand that I think our UCP is somewhat, not directly, but indirectly friendly and affiliated with the Conservative Party of Canada federally. And so I think, she has always said she's a federalist. And I don't think that Pierre Poilievre in particular wants to have to deal with Alberta pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan, which I think has negative ramifications for people in Quebec and Ontario. And necessarily, so what ends up happening is the rest of Canada wouldn't be very happy with Alberta. And it's an issue I think he doesn't want to have to deal with. But also her relationship with, the Prime Minister. And I think that's a big part of what factored into that. And thus you saw the UCP completely back away. They came out very strong initially and then completely went silent. And then that allowed room for unions in particular, which I don't know why they would ever be upset. This is a good thing for every Albertan. Every Albertan. And left room for unions and left room for the NDP to come in and say, don't mess with our pension. The government's going to steal your pension, which is not possible. They would have to set something up in a similar or like fashion to the Canada Pension Plan, in which case it would be independently managed.
You make a good point. It's completely illogical for workers, unionized or not, to oppose having an Alberta pension plan because those workers, our Alberta workers, are what's funding pensions for the rest of the seniors in
$3 to $5 billion a year.
So our ordinary workers are misled. And I go back to that point. If our premier is not going to let our people know who is, and I'm very thankful that you went out, Nadine, and talked all over Alberta about it.
Thank you. Well, it was a lot of fun. It was really great to listen to Albertans because so many of them, the two real big misconceptions that I came away with was one, people have a false sense of security in the Canada Pension Plan because there's a report that comes out every year that says, oh, it's sustainable. This is not going anywhere. But you know what? So the number of Canadians that we have that are contributing, that there's a benefit owed to, each Canadian is worth maybe $28,000. That's it. If Alberta were to leave tomorrow with just a modest $120 billion, and we've had, the professors at U of C and other places that have said, okay, well, worst case scenario, we're entitled to this amount. Each Albertan would be it's, I think, $54,000.
Just on the CPP alone.
Just by leaving. Just by leaving, we would actually be almost twice as rich.
Leaving the CPP.
And have twice as much security leaving the Canada Pension Plan.
Wow.
And we would be saving $3 to $5 billion a year. We could reduce our premiums or we could increase our benefits. Or we can actually structure a proper pension plan. So one of the other things I always tell people is you can't change what you don't control. And we don't own the Canada Pension Plan. So we can't influence it. We can't change it. The first thing and step, if we want to make change to that, is to bring it home. Bring it home. Now we can actually design a proper pension, something that is, you might have access, something that you might even be able to leave to your children instead of this payroll tax.
I have to wonder, and correct me if I'm wrong, people in Alberta have been rumbling about the Canada Pension Plan for a while. Danielle Smith becomes premier and begins to address it. And then suddenly she puts an obstacle in her own path.
Yes.
Is that not rather nefarious?
Well, to me, it just goes to say there's no intent to follow through on it.
No intent to follow through. Now, you've explained this really clearly in simple terms. So now we understand that young people in Alberta are contributing way more than they should to support the elderly population in the rest of Canada. And that's the simplest practical way of saying it.
Made on promises that the government has made to provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador, provinces like, again, Albertans would have better benefits at less cost if they were to do this themselves. So it truly is just a benefit to the rest of Canada, just like our equalization payments. Yes. Now, I mean, Quebec has its own pension, so they don't receive from the Canada Pension Plan. But just like an equalization, instead of the money going lump sum to Quebec, it's going to other provinces and their aging population.
Before we move on to equalization, can you express anything further in economist language, because most of us will understand what you just told us. There are a group of people who know numbers cold. Mm-hmm. And is there anything that you can tell our audience for those people who perhaps have a degree or a specific interest in investments right now? Just do the numbers. Realistically, run the numbers. When I ran the numbers, I was actually quite shocked at $3 to $5 billion, even using the CPP-IB's metrics, based upon a 6% rate of return year over year for this, the number of people that, Alberta has to support and the number of people that contribute, the savings, even starting with nothing. Like, go run the numbers. If you're that sophisticated, you're, a CFA, a CIM, whatever it may be, if you take the assets that we are entitled to, that just, that's a bonus in my opinion. And then you have to take a look at, from a vision perspective too. Yes. Like, when we can continue to stay in the rut that we're in, or, we can take a little bit of a short-term kind of take a step back and truly build something that is a pension, not a payroll tax, and is truly to the benefit of the next generations in particular of Albertans coming up. But, it's not rocket science. Anybody who's in this industry, you have access. They're all public reports from the CPP-IB. They're published every year. And there's a number of reports as well from around the world that talk about assets. They know what they all are. It's so simple and it makes so much sense and it's so easy to understand, which is why people say, oh, break it down for me. It's really not very little to break down. It is common sense. And when you know the numbers and somebody explains it to you like an equalization payment, they're like, never thought about it that way. Well, let's just go take the other side for a minute. Is there any benefit whatsoever for Albertans to continue with the CPP? I've had people say, well, I'm a proud Canadian. That's the only real benefit I can see. So nothing logical? Well, people are resistant to change. People don't like change. So an Alberta pension plan would be new, right? And people are afraid of new. They like the old and what they know, right? And so from that standpoint, people, the emotional kind of having to get over the fear is probably the biggest obstacle. But in reality, from a logic perspective, if you're just thinking about this from the cold, hard facts, yes, right? The cold, hard obvious, provable data, facts, there is nothing to be afraid of. Now let's move on to equalization. I think I was surprised to learn a number of years ago, and I hear from people, Alberta pays money to Ottawa for equalization. Mm-hmm. Now, that's actually not the way it works. As you would know, we pay taxes. We should actually say we give taxes to Ottawa through our payroll and through our corporate taxation. And it's Ottawa that puts that amount of money in a big lump sum pot, mm-hmm, and then distributes out to provinces, specifically two provinces, an amount of money that the provinces will receive based on a complicated formula. Mm-hmm. And Alberta never receives. And Stephen Harper actually made that to a lesser advantage for Alberta and a greater advantage to Quebec when he was Prime Minister. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Can you explain that? So what happened was we had a formula, and basically he just increased the cost to Albertans and thus giving more to Quebec. So the one thing you have to remember with Alberta is we are funding so many other activities within Canada. And as Prime Minister, and Stephen Harper figured this out really quick, because Stephen Harper made an honest effort, in my opinion. One of the few honest efforts that he did do was with the Senate and trying to make reform. The problem is that the majority of the population in Canada, the majority of the votes that you have to win are in Ontario and Quebec.
When you get to the Manitoba border, it doesn't matter. You can call the election right then and there. It doesn't matter how Alberta votes. It doesn't matter how Manitoba votes. It doesn't matter how BC or Saskatchewan votes.
Unless it's going to be a close minority.
Right? It is all about Quebec and Ontario, and they know they have to appease Quebec and Ontario. So I think for him, it was just really an election campaign where he could go back to Quebec and in hopes of winning another election, to be honest. But so you have to appease Quebec and Ontario if you're going to be prime minister. Pierre Poilievre will have the exact same problems. Which is why for so many Albertans, they go, well, why does nothing ever change for us? Yeah. Well, we had the sun, moon, and the stars align when Stephen Harper became prime minister. And what changed for Alberta? Nothing.
My understanding of one of the steps Stephen Harper took to make it more difficult for Alberta was the increase of the averaging of years that we had to do badly in order to receive equalization. Mm-hmm. I think it was something called the cap and floor, whatever. There's also the matter of using half of our resources monies to be calculated into the formula. And this is what apparently Danny Williams in Newfoundland became so angry with Stephen Harper about, is that Stephen Harper, according to Danny Williams, had promised to change that. That would be more favorable to provinces like Newfoundland and Alberta and Saskatchewan. And when elected, Stephen Harper did not make that change.
Yeah, like I said, he made matters worse,
yes.
Especially for oil and gas producing provinces. Interestingly enough, on the equalization, Quebec is a huge producer of hydroelectricity. I mean, it runs hydroelectricity down through the eastern seaboard. It's got, Churchill Falls. I grew up in Labrador. Churchill Falls is massive. And none of their revenues, zero, not $1, is attributed to the equalization formula. Yet every oil and gas dollar that's earned is attributed to the equalization.
Ottawa will not touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Nope. And I mean, Quebec is interesting because Quebec never signed the Constitution either. I mean, you got the Bloc Québécois, which is really a provincial party in federal politics. They don't have one single seat that they run outside of Quebec. And yet they received this year, I think it was over $60 billion. No, yeah, over $6.2 billion, I think, $6.2 billion in equalization payments.
From the big pot in Ottawa.
From the big pot in Ottawa. And Alberta got a big fat zero.
As
BC,
always.
Big fat zero. Saskatchewan, big fat zero.
Manitoba got a bit.
Manitoba actually was the second biggest winner out of this, which I found interesting. $4.2, I think, billion they got.
That's a distant second place.
That's a distant second place, but it's still a very big dollar amount.
Did Ontario get any money this year?
Ontario, I think, got 514 million, I think. But so you can see where the big winners are, right? They're not Quebec, or they're not Alberta and BC and Saskatchewan. They are certainly those eastern provinces and are more liberal leaning.
They got a little bag of popcorn instead of the great big carton.
Yeah.
What about the Maritime provinces?
The Maritimes get a little bit. Newfoundland, Labrador receives some. Obviously, New Brunswick usually gets some. Nova Scotia, PEI gets more on that front too. But I mean, if you take a look at even our Senate and how our Senate is structured, I mean, you got the eastern little provinces with, much smaller population than even Alberta would have.
Yes.
And they have far more representation than anything we have structured. Alberta, you wanted to talk a little bit later about 1905
yes.
Committee and when I started that and where the name came from. And the name came from looking back at 1905. It was a matter of, knowing what we know today, would we have done it the same way?
That's an interesting question. And I've done a bit of research before you came on that very question because you want to have context about what was life like in 1905. And we tend to think that this is the way it always was. We always had these paved streets. We always had a good social net.
We always paid this much tax.
Yes, and it will go that way forever.
Yeah.
Nothing will change in the next 125 years, except unless Elon Musk develops
Doge.
and little space trips, little space vehicles that can, go along the roadway instead of vehicles. But that's another day. So things really do change in 125 years. We now have, 1.45 million people in Alberta?
Alberta has a population of, I think, just over 4.
Over 4 million, that's
it's over,
right.
yeah, it's probably closer to about 4.5 million people right
and it's
now.
Edmonton I'm thinking about.
Edmonton, yes. And then Calgary, same thing. It's just over, I think, 1.4, 1.3, 1.4 million people as well.
So taking us back to 1905, there were certainly no million people in Alberta.
No, in all of Alberta,
Exactly.
There was no million people.
Exactly. So just prior to 1905, around the turn of the century, we actually had different territories, where there was the territory of Saskatchewan, the territory of Alberta, the territory of Assiniboine. And what I've learned is really interesting with our main cities in Alberta right now. Calgary started actually as a cow town. There were about 4,000 people before 1900, and people had a cow in their backyard and they roamed the streets. So it's not surprising that they became ranchers. They're a very religious town. There were 8 churches for 4,000 people, and they loved sports. They had a very interesting...
Go Flames, go. Right, there's the plug. And you wonder why Calgary and Edmonton are so combative when it comes to their hockey teams.
Calgary was always very sports-minded. They had the Blackfoot Indians there, and very athletic tribe. The interesting story about the man named Deerfoot is that was not his real name. I believe his real name was Little Scabby Meat or something to that effect.
Yeah, you had said little or scabby, scabby something. Yeah, scabby something meat.
And there was another Blackfoot fellow who was a really good runner also. Calgary has an interesting story. Back then, as we were talking, the people there were very sports-minded, and the Blackfoot tribe is around that area. They are also very athletic people. So what happened in the community, they began to have races. And the Blackfoot would go against the non-native people, and anybody could join. But the 3 real champions of that time was an RCMP, a mounted police officer. I'll start that again. The 3 main athletes during that period before 1900, first of all, a Northwest mounted police officer and 2 Blackfeet men. One was Little Plume, and the other was Scabby Dried Meat. The people involved in the race thought he needed a new name, and they gave him the name Deerfoot. The race was
not a bad call.
The race was actually a 4-day race, running 4 hours per day. So the first 2 days, Deerfoot won hands down. So the gamblers got together and they thought, we got to change this. And they got Deerfoot totally drunk. So on day 3, he lost badly. But on day 4, he came back and beat them hands down. So now Calgary has Deerfoot Trail. So that's a kind of a fun fact for Calgary.
Well, it's fascinating that you bring it up because people don't understand their own history anymore. It's like I've worked in finance for 20 years now, and if you do not know history, history repeats. Yes. Right? It always repeats. There's cycles, and the problem is we don't actually even know our own history. So Calgary and Alberta has this amazing history. We have all these street names, all these places, institutions that are called the Lougheed Building or Deerfoot or Gates Boulevard. Yes. And people don't even understand the history of where those names came from and the people and the stories and the families that built Alberta, which I think is rather sad, to be honest, because there are some fun little history and facts and stories that are to be told. And it's woven into the fabric of who Albertans actually are.
Let's talk about Edmonton. Edmonton is actually a 2-part city. Old Edmonton had a couple of thousand people in about 1900, and New Edmonton came along after that when the railroad was going through, and that was Strathcona. But they didn't have a bridge in between. So some really interesting entrepreneurs did a ferry. They also lobbied the Ottawa government, and they learned a hard lesson. So Edmonton's always been a business entrepreneurial city and has made real progress. And that we're talking Alex Taylor, we're talking Richard Secord, our first teacher. The Grey Nuns came into play in the late 1890s, and that hospital is still here. But we had a gentleman named Pierce, and he came from Ottawa to do resolutions for land. Our first mayor in Alberta was a fellow named McDougall, and he was involved in a land dispute. Other important names come up, but we needed that bridge instead of the ferry. And so the Tories were in power in Ottawa and showed no interest in getting Edmonton a bridge. The Tories were in power in Ottawa and had no interest in getting Edmonton a bridge. The Liberals promised they would.
Gee, let's buy some votes.
Yes.
It was even going on back then.
But the promise was, if the Edmonton people come up with 25,000, the Ottawa government would come up with 40,000. So the entrepreneurial Edmonton business owners, including Mr. McDougall, came up with their $25,000. And it took 5 years for the Liberal government to come up with the 40,000. People in Alberta learned really early on not to trust Ottawa. By 1900, Ukrainian settlers took the place of American settlers. So that became kind of like the crux of Edmonton, which was, again, about 4,000 people only. Mm-hmm. Then we moved to Medicine Hat, mm-hmm. which is named because the medicine man lost his hat. And that town was very business-minded. By 1900, it had about 1,800 people. And those business people were very entrepreneurial, apparently not so concerned about appearances. In fact, Cal walked into the local drugstore once and fell through the floor. But that's how Medicine Hat started. Mm-hmm. Lethbridge started because of coal along the banks of Lethbridge. They also had traders that came up to trade with the native folks with whiskey. Mm-hmm. And they had the main fort, Whoop-Up Fort, where all kinds of rowdy activities happened in Lethbridge. And that's the beginning of Lethbridge. Mm-hmm. Let's move to Red Deer. Now, that town was primarily settled by a preacher, a Methodist preacher named Gates. He came, and by 1900, there were about 700 homesteaders. So that's where we have Alberta, the big picture of Alberta. And there was Macleod, the rowdy town of Macleod.
Still pretty rowdy, according to the rest of Canada, right? It's like, the convoy, the Coots.
Yes. And back then, the men down there were wanted for the Boer War because they could shoot guns, they could ride horses, they were just great soldiers.
Well, you know what? They're still as industrious now as they were back then, even though the industry's changed a little bit.
So that was our world in coming up to 1905. Believe it or not, Alberta the territories had asked to become provinces coming up to 1905 and were rejected by Prime Minister Laurier. And who arose in that time is a very important figure. His name was Haultain. He was born in England. His family came to Ontario. He hopped a train in Ontario and came to Macleod. He was a lawyer and became a prominent politician and then a judge. He recognized ahead of time what would happen to Alberta and Saskatchewan if we became provinces. And he called us a colony within a colony. Mm-hmm. So he opposed the drive for the taking over of Alberta and Saskatchewan and predicted that we would basically become provinces.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess for a lot of people, again, not understanding the history, Alberta has not always been a separate province. So
That's
BC,
right.
Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the territories at one time were all, and I think was Manitoba. I'm not sure if Manitoba was a part of that, but they were all one landmass.
Yes.
That was on, and I don't mean landmass per se, but on a map, they were one entity. And I think Haultain actually really understood the intentions of what we call now the Laurentian elites and what they would do. We were meant to be just that resource that the Laurentian elites could actually just pull from.
Yes.
And yeah, so it was very much a colony within a colony. It's funny, he should add profit to his to his list of accomplishments as well, because yeah, he nailed it. And it's really interesting because in 1982, the concept Alberta Bill of Rights has been a big hot topic for a lot of people right now. Danielle Smith has, revamped them and has come out with, some revisions which have actually taken away the rights of Albertans.
Yes, they have.
As opposed to giving them more rights, we now have less rights.
Yes.
The government has more power to dictate and to enforce, because, of course, you have to understand what reasonable limits is defined. And if you understand the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and COVID did this very well, it really gave the government a lot of power. People thought, okay, well, I have the right to my bodily autonomy, I have the right to freedom, I can have the right to work, I have the right to speech, within reasonable limits. Well, who defines reasonable limits? And it's actually, I don't know if you're familiar, but Dr. Michael Wagner did an amazing book called Leaving God Behind. And it really addresses the 1982 signing of the Constitution. We had a lot of the provinces who said, were just opposed. They said, absolutely not. We do not want this. It changed Canada's complete structure from social as well as legal and political. And the reason being is because prior to this, Canada very much was a Christian nation. Now, I don't mean this to be from a religious standpoint. I'm just talking about, the values and the foundation of what we were built on. It was very much a Christian valued country. All our legal system, all our precedents had been always compared to, the 10 Commandments, for example, and from a Christian viewpoint, worldview. And he really pointed out the fact that Pierre Elliott Trudeau, with the signing of the Constitution, pretty much wiped that out, gave the power away from our parliamentary process, which is how you and I hold our representatives, accountable, and gave it to the courts.
Do you know the first case that went to the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
Big M Drug Mart.
Yes.
And that was on Sunday opening.
Yeah.
Alberta defended in order to keep Sunday opening, and we lost.
Yes.
The first case that went to the
But that
Court.
only happened after Pierre Elliott Trudeau's new Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into play.
Yes.
And because his new rules applied to a multicultural Canada, and now you got the new Trudeau Jr. talking about a post-nation state, that's exactly what we've got. And that was the intention all the way through. And we did have people just like Haultain who objected to joining in 1905. We had scholars, we had politicians, we had lawyers actually opposing the signing of the Constitution and Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982.
Right now, we have a groundswell of sorts in the last few years, since COVID in particular, of really intelligent, thinking people coming forward to talk about Alberta become its own nation, changes to the CPP, the problems of Danielle Smith removing our rights from the Alberta Bill of Rights, equalization problems that we've talked about today. We need to do things differently. For 125 years, we've had bright, intelligent people say, this is not good for the people of Alberta. But repeatedly, nothing has changed.
Well, part of the problem, I think, is politics. People vote upon party lines. They don't actually look at the individuals who are actually going to represent them in parliament or in legislature. And politics is a bit of a game. And you have these career politicians that learn how to play the game. We don't even know the rules, most of us, unless you're involved or you've taken the time to get involved. We're busy, right? We're raising kids. You got a job, you got this, you got that. I think all of that personally is by design. But on the political front, to think that one individual, even like a premier, is going to rescue us from the mess that we're in. I mean, I think it's unrealistic. I mean, I can't imagine the burden, that she must feel trying to deal with that on a day-to-day basis. But the reality is there's so many self-serving interests, lobbyists I have a huge problem with because they have the money and the resources and the ear and the attention of politicians. And they often guide a lot of the policies that we see as a result of the people. So oftentimes what's not even good for Albertans gets pushed on through because there's a self-interest or a lobby group that's pushing that. Our governments are no longer responsible for telling the truth.
That's true.
Right? They don't have to tell the truth. They don't have to speak the truth anymore. They're kind of absolved. They have no accountability. I have a huge problem with that because even things like net zero, I don't care if you agree with net zero, don't agree with net zero. The reality is the facts don't actually point to any real truth behind it. And so Danielle Smith keeps pushing this net zero by 2050, not 2030, but by 2050, because somehow net zero by 2050 is okay. In my opinion, 2030 is irrelevant. The fact that you're propagating a lie. So as Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his book, The Gulag Archipelago, actually made it very clear, it was one of my big takeaways from this book this big, was that you do not partake in the lie. So if you do not want communism to come to your doorstep, you do not want that authoritative, government-run, state-heavy, regulatory environment, you have to stand up and say, you know what, that is a lie. That is inaccurate, or there is no proof, no evidence to kind of support that. And that's what really needs to happen, is that we need a mechanism to be able to say to our government, and for one, they have to speak the truth. Right? And by truth, I mean, I want evidence, not that just because you said so.
Yes.
Look at what happened with COVID. Oh, it's this, it's this, it's this. None of them provided any evidence whatsoever. 6 feet, you maintain 6 feet distance. There was no evidence for that. Mm-hmm. Putting a mask on, there was no evidence for that. Oh, the vaccine is safe and effective. Now we're learning actually that the vaccine is extremely dangerous.
Yes, unfortunately.
Right? And has done tremendous damage. And the evidence is there to prove that. It was never there to prove it was safe and effective. And even the reports that they had that were never made publicly available indicated that it was not safe and effective.
Yes, it was not proved to be safe.
They promoted it to pregnant women. Even pregnant women today, I was told when I was pregnant with my daughter, I didn't have the German measles vaccine. They're like, oh, well, you get that, but not while you're pregnant. And yet they're still pushing the COVID vaccine on children now up to like 6 months old. You should get a COVID vaccine. You know, so my thing is like, Danielle, no, you don't have a responsibility to tell people what to do or what not to do. Yes, everybody deserves to have choice, but it should be informed. And it is our government's responsibility to provide us with a truthful, factual information so that we can be the ones to make the decision.
Correct. Thank you for bringing up COVID. And I certainly realized when COVID was happening that a lot of people were basically coming out of their political basements and had never seen the sun. So they came out and it was like they saw the sun for the first time. And they realized there's a political landscape out there that they needed to get involved in because it was affecting their life now. And they had no knowledge of what was really going on in politics. So I'd really like to thank you, Nadine. You've given us so much insight to some really critical matters that really do affect us on a day-to-day basis with the Canada Pension Plan, equalization, COVID, the context of 1905 when Alberta joined as a colony within a colony, Canada. And we've hit another one too that's not hitting my mind, but these topics have been so interesting. Thank you so much for coming today and sharing all of this with Alberta.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I love the opportunity to share a little bit of knowledge. And if nothing else, just spark curiosity in people, right? Questions are really, really good for people to kind of go, oh, I hadn't really thought about it that way, or that's a different perspective. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the whole definition of insanity is just keep doing what you're doing and expect a different result. If Albertans are truly sincere about making life better here, and I'm not concerned about making life better here for me, I'm concerned about making life better here for the next generation. Why? Because my daughter is a part of that next generation. Yes. That's where my interest lies. And, you know, it means that we have to get involved, take an interest, and start looking at things a little bit differently. And I think that starts with asking questions. So
very good.
Thank you so very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yes, it's been a joy. Thank you to our viewing audience, and tune in again. Thank you very much.
Truth and